Hello, welcome everyone. I'm glad you're here with me again. This week we had a more chill, I hope. I will ask how you felt afterwards anyway. Lecture by René. And yeah, might as well see what we do in the reading group for today. At first we will have a couple of reminders, both regarding the game studies lecture and also like the student journal. We will do the same as every time. We will have a recap and a space for open questions, and then we will talk about basically what we talked in the lecture. This is all those ideas about how we define play, game, and video game. We already talked quite a bit about it, but now we got some more information about it, so we'll recap that as well. We'll also talk about play and game in various languages, and you're all invited to present your own languages and how you have different words maybe for play and game and what the connotations of those are. But of course, that's all completely optional. We will take a closer look at the existing theories and definitions that René presented us. And then at the end, we will talk about the pragmatic definitions that are more for design theory, the MDA model, which is very important. I also just posted a link to the paper in our Discord, so if you want to take a look at that, you can do that as well afterwards. And at the end, we will have some more practical discussion about games, some edge cases, if they actually can be considered games or not, by which definition, which is always a fun exercise in my opinion. So let's start right away with the reminders. So first of all, René asked everyone to give feedback about the lecture. I want to remind you all of that once again. This is like the half-term feedback, so we're about halfway through the lecture. And the way you can give this feedback is basically by sending it to Stefan Hohnwald, who I think is not joining us today, unfortunately, but you can send it to him on Discord. His name is Stefan Hohnwald, or you can send it to him via email. He will collect it, anonymize it, and then post it onto the Moodle forum for René to read and respond to it. So if you have ideas or criticisms of the game studies lecture, and I'm sure you do, also positive feedback, of course, then please be aware of this possibility to give feedback. You can also mention what we do here in the reading group, of course, if you tell René that this is working well, or if you want to say something about me that I have to take to heart. I'm sure Stefan will post that as well. And if there is like a voice to be heard that this reading group is helping people, then I'm sure they will do it again next time. Because I'm not sure if everyone realized this, but this is the first time we have this reading group basically officially for the game studies lecture. Also, keep in mind that at the end of the semester, there will be the proper feedback channel through the university system, where you can type in your feedback and answer some questions about how the lecture was for you on the campus website. But this one is more personal because it will be only seen by René and the students, and nobody else knows about it, whereas the university feedback is open for everybody basically to see what you write in there.
So it's not mandatory, right?
No. It's not mandatory at all.
But it's anonymous. Very important.
And anonymous and highly recommended to do. Well, let's just ask everyone, what did you think of the last lecture? Was it more relaxing to you, or did you not feel a real difference at all? I'm curious about that.
I think it was far more relaxing, and a big reason for that were the slides, because now he's using Felix slides and they're just more informative, because if you afterwards look at René's slides, it's not really helpful. It doesn't give you any facts or anything. So and also I guess the material wasn't so heavy this time around. It wasn't so complex. So and there were things that we had already talked about. So it was far easier to follow his train of thought for me.
Okay. I'm glad you feel so as well. That's what I thought too, but maybe somebody feels different.
For me, it felt the same.
The same as Rachel, or the same as the weeks before?
As the last lectures.
Okay, I see. So it's still kind of hard to follow. Yeah, well, that's René's style, I guess. So that's definitely valid.
Probably it's because it's my fault because I'm from a technical background. Not
It's
his
definitely
fault.
not your fault. But it's an important perspective, and to make René realize this perspective, you can give feedback in one way or another. You don't even have to write full sentences, it can just be keywords as well. So just keep that in mind. And René is usually very open to feedback. He will argue against it. I will let you know that as well, because that's how René is, but he will nevertheless take it to heart and maybe change some things, especially for next year's and the coming lectures.
I have a question. The last year's game studies was the same course?
Last year's game studies was basically we were given the papers we had to read, and there was no lecture at all. We were just supposed to read the papers and then take the exam.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and many students were very unhappy with that, so we basically wrote a complaint, a whole letter complaining about the system, and then we got basically Felix to give us some of the lectures that are now taken up by René.
Damn, Jesus.
But if you take part of this course in this semester, in the next year or the next semester, you have to do it again? I'm not really sure how it works.
I'm not sure what you mean. So the idea is you have to take the exam and pass it once, the game studies exam.
So if you pass the exam in this semester, you're done with game studies?
With game studies, the
lecture.
Yes.
Because I was a little bit confused because it seems that you and Benjamin were at the last lecture.
Yeah, we were.
I think they are every.
Last semester, I mean.
Yeah, we were there last year, both Benjamin and I, because we're both
Not the last semester. Not the last semester.
Last year, yes.
Last year.
Last winter semester.
And now we're here. I'm here as a tutor, and Benjamin is just here because apparently he has nothing better to do.
Oh, okay. So you're not taking the course again.
Exactly.
You're taking the course to teach us.
Yes, that's my job basically. Yes.
Ben, thank you for having this reading group.
Yeah, it was Benjamin's idea originally, so maybe that's why he's here.
It's my baby.
Well, thank you to Benjamin.
Okay, so yeah, let Stefan and thus René and also me know if you have any feedback about the lecture and the reading group in that regard. And if you have any questions, please always come at me with them. Also, the second thing I wanted to mention, maybe Rachel wants to take over, but otherwise just another reminder about the Students' Journal. The deadline is next Wednesday on the 1st of December. And it's a really good opportunity to realize. I know some of you already did, and I'm really glad about that. But I think right now we still don't have even nearly enough submissions to fill out a whole journal. So chances are good that you will get selected basically to be printed in a journal, which is already a pretty cool thing. If you just submit something.
Sorry for interrupting you. Hope it's not a problem if we wrote more than 800 words.
Yeah, I don't think it will be, but you will get feedback anyway. And after you get the feedback, you will have a chance to eventually rewrite your thing and include the feedback that you got officially. And then the last version will actually be printed in the journal. So if there is a problem, like you wrote 810 words, which is most definitely not a problem, but if you wrote like 1,200 words, for example, then you will probably get feedback to shorten it a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah, plus minus 10% is always okay. It's the rule of thumb. But yeah, this reminder is basically also if any of you have ideas but don't know what to do next, or if you have writer's block or something, just contact me or anyone else from the KCGL and we can sit down together.
By the way, I just checked the submission and someone submitted from a complete different university. So
yes, I saw it too. It's very exciting.
Yeah, well, we got already some what's it called? Competition.
Submission. Oh, competition, yeah.
So
I have a
yeah.
problem regarding this.
Mhm.
I've actually wrote something a few weeks ago,
Mhm.
but I didn't submit it because I thought, I don't know, it probably isn't what you're looking for. And is there any example? I think this is the first time this is happening, right?
Mhm.
Students writing for the journal.
Yeah.
So there was no example I could find, and I feel like you're looking for something maybe academic or kind of research based. But what I've wrote is kind of from my own perspective and knowledge in games, and I didn't submit it because of that. But are those kind of things okay, or does it have to be like
Submitted.
a research? Okay, that was a very fast and quiet.
So
Complete
you
research.
definitely can't go wrong with submitting it. So the worst thing you will get is feedback, and feedback is always good for you because you can learn from it. But in general, like if you do, like for example, a philosophical essay, you don't really do hard research as you might expect, but you basically write your own thoughts, but you have to go through an argument and reason it out well, maybe give some sources, and maybe you will just get feedback. Yeah, maybe look at that and that source. Doesn't this basically say the same thing that you do, or in a different way, and you could use it as an argument for what you're writing about, and then you can include that, and if it's good enough, it will actually be printed in the journal. And if you're really unsure and you want me or maybe Rachel or one of us to take a look at it before you submit it even, so you get some feedback at first and then some more feedback once you submitted it, that's also fine.
Thanks. I'll send it later.
Yeah, you're welcome. Looking forward. And yeah, Rachel said if you have an idea but have writer's block, also if you don't have any idea at all and just want to talk about something that's somehow related to dev, to basically brainstorm some ideas together with us, you can also do that. Just let us know. We can do it via voice here on Discord or via text or whatever you like. But yeah, submissions are closing soon, so get that done. Like 600 to 800 words is really not much. I'm confident everyone can do that. Alright, then let's get started with the actual reading group thingies that we always do. The recap from last time. Maybe some of you remember we had a very dense session last time with all that cyborg, transhumanism and stuff. At first we started talking a little bit about embodied gameplay. So the whole idea that all of our consciousness and experience is embodied, it is here and now. Renee also talked specifically about primary and secondary reality. So the whole idea that we're basically living in a primary reality and within the game is, if you want, a secondary reality. But all of this is basically interconnected and in constant interaction with each other. Those are just the things you have to keep in mind. This whole idea of being interconnected also goes into the idea of a cyborg. How we playing games is basically already a connection with a system, a technological system that basically makes us that basically serves as an extension and thus makes us cyborgs. We talked a lot about cybernetics and feedback loops. Many of you brought really great examples about games using negative and positive feedback loops. Maybe you remember the negative feedback loops are the ones that stabilize everything, basically bring it to the same level that you as a game designer probably want. Whereas positive feedback loops basically make something spiral out of control, and those are way harder to use properly. We also talked about DDA. Anyone remember what DDA stands for?
Dynamic difficulty adjustment.
Very good. So what does that mean?
Basically changing the difficulty of the game based on the player's skill and how they process through the game.
Very good. Yep. We also had some nice examples in that regard. Then we talked more about theoretical stuff like agency and cyborg. We got some definitions of agency. So, and as I know Renee, agency is one of the more important buzzwords to him. So chances are that you will need a definition of agency in one way or another at some point. And finally, we also talked about transhumanism and posthumanism. Those are maybe the most difficult points to grasp because they're basically very abstract intellectual movements that only very indirectly have something to do with video games after all, right? But if you consider the whole way technology advances and allows us to basically extend ourselves into virtual worlds, it's something that has to be kept in mind even when we study just video games. And those are the two movements maybe you remember about human evolution. The main difference between transhumanism and posthumanism is that transhumanism believes that we're still in a transitionary state, and posthumanism says we already arrived at our final state of a post-human, so basically that the evolution is already complete. And finally, we also mentioned Gray and Hugh with their books on cyber citizenship and those two different approaches to it. Any questions in that regard? Or ideas or something you would like to mention? If not, then we can already move on to the new topics. So, as you may remember, we talked a lot about play and games in this week's session. It was a lot more, in my opinion at least, how do you say, locker, so not as stressful maybe. And René gave us a whole list of words that are used in different languages for play and game. Also the origin of the word play in English, as it comes from Old High German with Pflegern, which also influenced the current German word pflegen, to care. And then you have all of those, some of those words you might remember from other ways we already use them, like paideia in argon in Greek. Then René also included the first native languages from America, Algonquin, I think you pronounce it, with Kwani and Kaxi, which is the difference between child's play and a more adult version of play. You have Chinese or Mandarin, in this case probably with Wan and Sai, where you differentiate between play in general and a more skill-based approach. And you have Japanese, where René told us that he doesn't really have any idea because Felix included it and he doesn't care about Japanese culture in general, which of course hurt me personally a little bit. But at least I was able to help him out with pronunciations. You have Asobu, which is a very is everything non-serious, so it's not even limited to just playing games. But basically, if you go out drinking the night, you can also say asobu, which means I'm going out to play, right? And then you also have asobase kotoba, which is this whole idea of this basically female-only language, and there you basically put this asobase at the end of every sentence, which tells the other person that it's meant in a playful way, and it's a very polite and formal way of expressing oneself. And this is already gives you an idea how play and games are used very differently all across different cultures. Maybe some of you have some examples from your own languages. If so, please let me know right now.
Well, in Russian, the word for play is играть or игра. I don't know the etymology of this word, but yeah.
How is it used?
What do you mean by how is it
like,
used?
Do you use it for board games and video games and like sports bets, for example? Or are those different things?
Yeah, it's the same for sports, it's the same for video games, it's the same for board games. It's all the same word that's used in all these situations.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Would you also use it in theater? As in English, for example, you use play?
Yes, you say играть роль, so you play a role, yeah.
Interesting. Then it is very similar, yes. Thank you. Any other examples? Well, I guess not. Well, this is probably not relevant to the exam at the end of the lecture, so don't worry too much about it. You won't need to type down any Chinese or Japanese words for play and game. But it's still something interesting to keep in mind, that your cultural background might also influence how you take a look at the words game and play and their definitions. This also This was another example René gave us with the whole idea of try to define game in one word. I think most of you were in the lecture anyway, but maybe some of you want to try again. I wrote down what was said in the chat back in the lecture, but maybe some of you have a new idea by now how you could try to define game in one word.
Rules.
Wow, nerd. So if you had to say, what did Benjamin out himself as right now? More of a ludologist? Or what was the other side called?
Narratologist, but he surely was a ludologist.
Very good.
I would say when I think of games, I would say freedom.
Oh, that's a new one. Very American of you.
I would say escapism.
Oh, that's also a new one. Interesting. And okay, so you already take very different approaches with that. Let us.
What about amusement?
Amusement.
Yeah.
That's also pretty good. So amusement goes hand in hand almost with fun. It's slightly different, of course, if you want, because amusement is more of the purpose of something, whereas fun is then the subjective result. But fun, experience, interaction, and interesting were the 4 one-word definitions that were given during the lecture. But maybe let us think a little bit more about escapism and freedom. So do you think that those go hand in hand, or are those almost kind of opposites to each other?
I would say neither. When you escape into a novel, it's a rather linear experience and you don't have a lot of freedom, but it nonetheless helps you to escape the reality that you're into in life that you maybe don't enjoy as much. So I would say freedom can be part of escapism, but the degree of freedom doesn't limit escapism or doesn't hinder it, at least.
Interesting. Do you think freedom is inherent to every game?
I think so.
Okay. Why?
Because the primary goal of a game is to make you feel better, to make you feel relaxed, and you have to enjoy your time playing a game. So,
and
it comes with your freedom.
So, do you think people need freedom to enjoy things? Well, those are basically things you can think about when you do philosophy about games. But it's all very interesting because this is basically where you go when you have to try to define things. To recap some of the things that René also mentioned, to the one-word definitions. Yes?
I think when you think of games and the fact that you enter a magic circle, you escape from reality, you get detached of the real world, and this comes with a sense of freedom.
Okay, so you also basically use Eva's one-word definition of escapism in combination with freedom. So they basically supplement each other more than being opposites.
I think escapism focuses on the action, and freedom focuses more on the feeling, on the mood.
Okay, then freedom, for example, ties very well to the whole idea of agency that we already discussed a couple of times. So basically, most people will feel freedom to do what they want if they are given agency. So basically that they have the ability to make choices that are in line with their intentions, as we learned last time. And also basically to configure the world they are in to leave a lasting impact in some way. So this is all ties into the idea I think Stefan mentioned, interaction. So those are core ideas, because otherwise, if you don't have freedom to do what you want, maybe you feel like you're not even really interacting with a system, you're just watching it. Then somebody also mentioned experience during the lecture. This ties to Sylvester's definition or idea of games as engines of experience. We will not talk about that today, unfortunately, but it will come up in one of the later lectures. And lastly, interesting. One of my personal favorite definitions, which is also somewhat controversial, is Sid Meier's idea of a game is a series of interesting decisions. Can somebody maybe give me an example of a game where they think it doesn't fit this idea of a series of interesting decisions?
I think all the 3 game and I quote games you posted for us to check. LSD, whatever, and the other one. None of them were matching any of these, literally.
Well,
was fortunate.
We will discuss those at the very end of today. Okay, go
Probably
ahead.
walking simulators.
Yeah, like Dear Esther and stuff.
And clickers.
I would disagree with the walking simulators, because you can approach the narrative differently, right? You can enter the house and decide to approach
not every
the
walking
narrative with first
simulator, like just
looking at what? Okay, so basically making already decisions of how to approach the narrative can be already an interesting choice of unveiling the narrative in a different sequence.
But some games don't even allow you that, right? You will always be pushed into the same sequence.
True.
So yeah, unfortunately I haven't played Dear Esther, but I think the way it works, you don't really have much choice. But yeah,
I mean, can we say that the Stanley Parable is a walking simulator?
we can. Do you think you have choices in it though? Or interesting decisions to be made?
Well, it's a bad example, because in Stanley Parable you have choices. You can make choices. There is a sequel to that game. I can't remember what's its name.
The Beginner Guide.
Yes.
Beginner's Guide.
Or let me check real
I think
quick.
it is.
There's also the Crows and something. The name is really weird. It's like Tiger, Crow, something.
Yeah, the Beginner Guide. That game follows a linear story, and you can't have decisions. You can make decisions. So you only follow a narrative line that is presented to you. You don't. You only have to move to continue the story.
Yes, and we already.
Okay, yeah, but you cannot say every walking simulator is not a game, because there are so many examples that are a game, and they have many interesting interactions, and honestly, they are a very fun experience.
I didn't say that every walking simulator could not be a game.
Yeah, but you started by mentioning just walking simulators, and
I mentioned a genre where the majority of the games in that genre could not represent a game.
Or at least they don't fit the definition we're using right now of a series of interesting decisions, right? So what you can see here is that we already have problems with applying those definitions, and this basically goes hand in hand with the big problems we have that René also mentioned during the lecture. So of course, as you all probably have noticed by now, it's very hard to give a watertight definition of game or video game. There's those 3 big problems that we mentioned. The first one is that games and video games in general are just too diverse, and it's also very subjective of whether we experience something as a game or as just a visual experience of some kind, for example, right? You could argue that the experience when playing a walking simulator is exactly the same as when watching a YouTube playthrough of the same walking simulator. There's also some cultural and linguistic ambiguity that we saw just a little bit earlier when we discussed the whole different words we have for play and game in different languages. And there's also different connotations and denotations. So those are basically what is explicitly said, but there's also always something that's kind of implied a little bit. English is unfortunately not a great example of that, and German also not necessarily, because they, especially in the case of games and play, they don't have a lot of connotation. But other languages, for example, as we saw with Chinese, they have similar words for play, but they always have a very different connotation. So for example, if something is more for a child or something is more skill-based. And finally, the boundaries of what can be considered a game and not a game are very unclear. So some things are 100% a game according to almost everybody, and some are 100% not a game. But what is between those edge cases where people argue about, those are the boundaries that are so hard to define properly.
When we talk about defining video game and game, we also talk about defining play.
Not necessarily. We talked already quite a bit about defining play, and we will also come back to that with Homo Ludens today. But right now we're mostly talking about video game and game. Why? Do you have something specific to say?
Because I was thinking, why can't we say that a game is an activity that a person enjoys doing it, and stop there?
A game? So, because do you think that is a universal definition that applies to everything?
I think it would fit the most cases.
So, for example, take working in a factory. There will be always a worker that enjoys what he's doing there, and there will always be a worker that doesn't enjoy what he's doing there.
And for the worker who enjoys it, that could be a game, and for the worker who doesn't enjoy it, it can't.
Okay,
yeah.
But then you have very subjective definitions, and our goal with using definitions is already that we have a common understanding of everything.
So it needs to be objective.
As far as it can be, of course, right? Because truly objective, that's a different story.
But I think having a term like game or video game very objective, I mean, you can please everybody.
Yes, but you can try. But yeah, that's an important insight, right? There will always be exceptions. And there will always be somebody who tries to poke a hole in your definition. And that's why we will learn a couple of ways to go about that today as well. But yeah, as we already mentioned, the whole idea why we need those definitions or the benefits from having them is, for example, that we have a common understanding for discussion, both in general and also in academia, where it's even more important that everyone is talking about the same thing. So, for example, when you read a paper about games, but the author uses a completely different definition from what you're used to as a game, then, of course, you will have problems understanding what they're trying to say. Also, it's important to narrow down the fields when doing research or as an academic scholar. And finally, to structure your arguments properly, both you and your opposite have to have a common understanding, otherwise those arguments will not work out. So basically, those are all three more or less the same point, that to communicate properly between people, you need common definitions that everyone agrees on. Otherwise, it will most likely not work out. And those definitions can be made explicitly. For example, you can write in your paper, this is my definition of a game, and I will talk about it in this context. Or it can be more implicit, where you just assume that everyone has the same definition of something. With many words, that works perfectly well. You don't need to define most words every time you write a paper, but with some words, like for example game, it's much harder. So let's take a look at some of the existing theories and definition. So René already started with play, and one of the oldest books in that regard is by George Herbert Mead, and he wrote about the whole idea of children using role play and child's play to learn about society and learn how to communicate, and basically that humans use play, not even games yet, but just play, as a tool for learning. and that was one of the first breakthroughs. Then shortly afterwards came Hausinger. So by now we already talked a lot about Johann Hausinger with his famous book Homo Ludens. So I remember we had some discussion in the class because Homo Ludens basically means the playing human. And I think somebody argued that animals play as well. So why is it only humans that get the title Homo Ludens? Well, it's basically just a wordplay as well on the whole idea of having different species of man with Homo sapiens, etc. But it basically is supposed to show that play is very inherent to our nature as humans. And that is the idea. It's not the idea to exclude other animals for some reason. And Hausinger wrote about the idea of the magic circle. We already talked about it quite often. The whole idea that play must be voluntary, disinterested, limited, it must have rules. It has some kind of grouping, or secrets if you want, with the whole idea of in and out groups. And basically it's also autotelic. This means that it has a purpose in and of itself. René also mentioned even more explicitly this time that this whole idea of the magic circle is foundational but debatable. There's a lot of critique. Like, for example, it's not watertight. You will take something into the magic circle, and once again you will exit with some new insight, maybe, maybe not. It is very subjective. It might be too formalist, too individual, and you can also, I think there was one theory about it having basically 3 layers of a magic circle. So it's definitely a theory that can be extended upon or can be critiqued, but it still is one of the most famous buzzwords in game studies. So just keep that in mind. Here you can also see finally a picture of good old Hausinger. I didn't even know how he looked like before I looked it up. And then here in the background you have one of the more famous philosophers in general that doesn't even necessarily have anything to do with games directly. But Wittgenstein wrote a lot about language, and within language he also wrote about language games, or Sprachspiele as they were mentioned in German, not Wortspiele as many people assume incorrectly. But he tried to show how family resemblance works as definitions. So this word, family resemblance, or Familienähnlichkeit in German, is very important to us as game studies people. Why? Because it allows for a definition of a thing or a concept by basically a collection or sets of attributes. But it's important that none of those attributes are absolutely essential to the thing that you're describing. And Wittgenstein even gave games as an example. That's why he's so famous in that regard, because basically for games you have a collection of attributes, many of which we already discussed today and prior as well. But you can always find a game that doesn't fit all of those attributes. Only for every attribute you will also find a game that does not have this attribute. Is that somewhat clear? Because that's maybe a little bit of a complicated concept, but basically you can define something with a group of characteristics that are needed for that definition, but you will find within the thing you define always basically edge cases and things that don't fit of the characteristic that are mentioned for the family resemblance.
Would it mean that genres are a group of attributes, and the game that are in that genre includes more attributes, and each one is special? There are no 2 games alike?
So genre is also a good idea. Like maybe you heard a lot from Felix about that already in his lecture on horror games or horror survival games, where he talked a lot about genre, or last year when he had an extra course on genre itself, because that's basically Felix's field of study. But while those family resemblances work for genre as well, within video games and also within other things like movies, for example, here we're not talking about genres, we're talking about games themselves. So we define games or video games by a similar concept, similar to genres, where you basically have all those cliches which make up the horror genre, and every game needs some of those, and basically by finding out which fit the best, you can kind of define vaguely which genre it belongs to. You take an artifact, like one of the video games we will discuss today, for example, and look, does it have many of those attributes? Does it have enough of them? And if it does, you can define it as a game.
I understand.
You do?
Yeah, we're not talking about what the game contains, but what the game is.
Mm-hmm. Of course, what it contains can also be an attribute, but in this case, we're talking about how we define games from the outside, yes. So yeah, I will only mention this quickly because René mentioned some criticisms of all of those existing theories and definitions, and the big criticism he gave to Wittgenstein is that definitions are basically always arbitrary and do not exist outside of the human mind. This kind of flows into the whole idea of postmodernism and post-structuralism if you want, but I don't think we need to think too much about that right now, unless somebody wants to. So we saw some more existing theories and definitions. Those are now already after the war. So the first one is by Bateson, Gregory Bateson in 1955, and he talked more about games being meta-communication. So meta in that case means basically we're talking about communication, and how can we learn about communication by playing games. So basically by communicating about communication, we learn about it. So, but of course, what is very obvious here, like communication is always between multiple humans, in that case at least. You could also argue about communication between machine and human, but that was not even relevant back then. So the criticism is that's not really applicable to some games, because as most of you will know, some games, even back in 1955, were played alone. So solitaire was already a thing. The next one is somebody we already talked about a lot, Caillois in 1958 with his book Men, Play and Games. He gave us those words we already mentioned quite often with agon, alea, mimicry, illings, and then the scale between ludus and paideia. So the big criticism here that comes from Felix, as far as I understand, is that those are very arbitrary and biased. Basically, it is very subjective what can be considered agon, alea, mimicry, or illings. René doesn't agree with that, and so you don't have to either, just keep that in mind. But it is one of the criticisms that can be handled here. So basically, you can have a game where it's not clear if it fits in one of those categories, but nobody is arguing that it has to fit only one of them, right? A game can always have multiple of those elements within it. And finally, we have Marshall McLuhan, who should be a name you recognize by now as well, with one of his older works, Understanding Media. And anyone remember what Marshall McLuhan is famous for? It's one of the sayings, one of the quotes. He's considered the founding father of media studies.
Has to do with massages.
More or less. So the famous quote by Marshall McLuhan is, "The medium is the message," or "the massage," as his book was called on purpose. And he's talking about the idea that all media is a prosthesis for the human body, or extension of your human body. And he's also talking about catharsis a lot. So basically that you get some kind of purification of your negative emotions at the end of consumption. And that's the whole goal of consuming media. Of course, both of those things, both the idea that all media is an extension of your human body, or that you will have catharsis at the end of every media consumption, don't apply to all forms of, not even media, but also not to all forms of games. So catharsis is something that's more often used in the context of dramas, in especially tragedies. Why do humans watch tragedies? Because at the end they will have some kind of feeling of catharsis. It's the whole idea that it will cleanse you from your emotions. But this is already very abstract philosophical talk, so just keep in mind that those existing theories and definitions exist, and where to find them if you have to take a closer look. So finally we come to more formal definitions. So those already work with games as systems. The whole idea that you have a system you interact with and each individual parts. And René mentioned that that's why games are so important to our society nowadays, because they teach systemic awareness to people that use them. So basically you become aware how individual parts of a system influence the whole system, and this allows you also to understand things like society better. We have Salen and Zimmerman, which we already talked about quite a lot as well in 2004 with their famous book Rules of Play. So last year I can tell you we had to read, I think, like 5 chapters from that book. So it was quite influential for game studies as a whole and also for our lecture. And they define games as with a couple of points. Those are it's basically a system that needs a player. There needs to be an artificial conflict. There needs to be rules, which basically goes hand in hand with the system. And there needs to be a quantifiable outcome. So maybe, yes?
Sorry, I would like to add something. So here the definition of games. They are defining games as video games, or it's a general definition? Because like in the 50s, maybe they are defining games looking to Olympic games or all games. But these, nowadays definitions of games, I think they are based on video games or in general. That's my question.
Right now we're still talking about games in general, and later we will talk about what specifically makes video games a little bit more different. And Salen and Zimmerman also specifically mentioned video games. We will mention later what differentiates basically video games from traditional board or card games, which are mostly what we're talking about right now. But of course, those definitions need to include everything, both board games and video games. That's the whole idea, especially from the newer definitions, right? You could argue in the 1940s, nobody cared about what a video game was because they didn't even know they existed. But of course, in 2004, they were already very well aware of it. René mentioned that he has some problems with some of those points that Salen and Zimmerman used to define games. Any idea which points those could be? Because of course you will always find exceptions that don't use some of those. The ones he mentioned are artificial conflict and quantifiable outcome. So by artificial conflict, you don't necessarily need to have a conflict of you versus another player or some kind of in-game rival, but it could also be, for example, you against time. So I think somebody brought up the example of Tetris, where there is no clear conflict, but of course you basically have the conflict of you having to fight against time when the blocks fall down and you need to react accordingly. Then quantifiable outcome. That is at the very least a binary state, like win, lose, dead, alive, or some kind of high score later on. Like that you basically can do better or worse at a game. Many of you will realize this is basically some kind of old thinking, especially when you think about arcade games where you always had the high score and the win and lose scenario. But many modern games don't really use those anymore. So that's why this is also one of the criticisms, especially that it has to be quantifiable. So quantifiable means that it's possible to express in numbers, at least 1 and 0 for win and lose, or a number for a high score, basically, for how well you did.
I don't think it's old-fashioned. I think even newer games need quantifiable outcome.
Mm-hmm. Well, then you will probably have a very strong opinion on some of the edge cases we will discuss today, because most of them probably don't have a quantifiable outcome. But that's fine. You can find your own definition and work with it. And then Jesper Juhl, who's also a famous name, which we didn't mention too often yet, in his book Half Real from 2005, gave us a similar definition of games. So in addition to what Salen and Zimmerman already wrote about, he also talks about attachment to the outcome. So basically that as a player, you have some kind of reason to want a better outcome. And this is basically what makes games games. Because if you don't care what the outcome is, Jesper Juhl would argue that it's no longer a game. This famous graphic you can see on the left side here is also from his book. And this basically, as you can see, tries to define what are definitely games in the innermost circle. They have fixed rules, variable outcomes, player effort, player attachment to outcome, negotiable consequences, and the last one I can't really read, but this is valorization of outcome, I think. Then you have all those edge cases where it's not really clear, or it can be argued about whether it's a game or not by his definition. And at the very outside you have all those things that are not games by his definition. Like, for example, Ring Around the Rosie. So basically you dance around in a ring with somebody. You have a fixed outcome, but you don't have an attachment to that outcome, because in the end you don't really care about it. You're just doing it for the fun in itself. Keep in mind, all of those definitions can be argued against, but though they're still useful to use. And finally, we already talked about that one as well, the grasshopper by Seuss. So if you remember, this was a more philosophical approach, and the central thesis here was that playing games is all about overcoming voluntary obstacles, so that games are inefficiently designed in and of themselves, because we're basically engaging with something that makes our life harder, but by our own voluntary decision to do so. Then finally we come to Jenkins once again. Maybe some of you remember Jenkins as the guy who, with his idea of video games as narrative, or video game designers as narrative architects, kind of, according to some, overcame the whole ludo-narrativist divide. And he focuses more on the experience you get when playing a game, which is already very similar to Sylvester later on as well, and the designing of architecture from a game designer's perspective. He also argues that the majority of games is bland and uninteresting, which is already a very strong statement. I also added Sturgeon's law here, which some of you might recognize as the idea that 90% of everything is crap, which is quite an extreme statement as well. But especially when it comes to media, or when you look at how the internet works nowadays, one can always find out that this more or less holds true, that 90% of whatever you're looking at will not be relevant to you personally. Of course. Yes?
Sorry, finish your idea.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, not if you talk about anime.
You can always argue that more than 90% of everything is crap. And then you have what's also central for Jenkins is the whole idea of interaction, which we already talked about quite a lot. And the idea that you immerse yourself in the game, and also that you perform an identity, which might not be the same identity you have in primary reality, but playing a game allows you to express an identity anew, or try out a new identity, which is also something that's unique to games. Then, yeah, as we already mentioned before, the whole idea of how do we differentiate between games and video games especially. So Salen and Zimmerman describe how video games basically extend the whole idea of games, and the use of computers allows to... Oh, I have a typo in here. It's not complexity, it's complexity. And you get all of those systems automated. So if you keep in mind a game like a board game or a tabletop RPG, you usually have somebody who needs to keep track of the whole system and how it runs. And if all of this is automated by a computer, you get the possibility to just increase complexity on a scale that is impossible to follow on paper or in traditional game formats. And you also have networked systems. So René mentioned that this is true in two ways. The first one is, of course, the internet or local area networks, basically that allow you to connect to other players and interact with them on their own machine without interacting directly. So you basically have the system as a mediator between the two of you, and no way of interacting directly with the other person. And you also have the whole idea of a network around the game on a meta level. So basically having a community. I personally think this is not the greatest argument for video games being different from board games, because I think board games can also have communities, or especially tabletop RPGs can also have communities. So I think this whole idea of networked systems is more about the real technical aspects of it all.
I think that nowadays everything has a community.
Yeah, also thanks to the internet, of course, but yes, very true. And finally, a little bit more of a philosophical view on video games from a German book called Computerspiele eine Ästhetik. This is one of the, I think, Felix's favorite books, which is why it's in here. But this one is once again the whole idea that video games are consciously marked by sets of attributes, and we, as the consumers of video games, set those attributes. So basically they can also change over time. So what is considered a video game nowadays can be different from the past or the future, which is also why discussions like whether walking simulators are video games or not could be very important a couple of years back, but in the future everyone will just recognize them as one or not. And in Feige's book there's also this principle of playing through oneself. So in German it's das Prinzip des sich selbst durchspielens, which works better in German because you have the idea of playing through a game means finishing a game. And playing through oneself is basically finishing yourself, whatever that might mean. In English it doesn't work, but it basically generates new insight about yourself and also shows us this whole way of how player and game are interconnected. So not only you as a player have an influence on the game, but also the game will have an influence on you. There's also Sylvester's famous quote of "I am the games I've played," which is basically very similar in that regard. So some criticism in the whole idea of how we define video games by socially set markers is of course that there will always be borderline areas and edge cases. Like for example, right now you have art installations and certain simulators. Like very famously, Microsoft Flight Simulator is something that was developed to teach people how to fly. But if you ask some people, they will argue it's a game because they play it only for enjoyment, whereas others actually use it for its original purpose to learn how to use a flying machine, what's it called? An airplane properly, or pilot the cockpit. So you have very different use cases. Would you then argue it's a game because some people say it is and others not? And those are the problems you have when you basically depend on society for a definition. And also art installations, where we have one of those as an example of the edge cases afterwards as well. And the problem here is often that people that develop those art installations themselves are very explicit in that they don't want it to be a game. But people that visit the installation will still engage in a playful manner and recognize it as a game when they interact with it. So who is right in that regard? It's also a different question, difficult question.
What exactly are art installations?
So for example, when you go into a museum, and right now it's pretty popular in technical museums that you have some kind of camera and a screen, and you will be somehow projected onto the screen and will be able to interact with the virtual world that's on the screen.
Oh, okay.
So something like that. So example that was given to us was the whole text train thingy, where you move your arms around. I have some screenshots afterwards, and the text will fall basically onto your hand that you see on the screen. So those are more the artistic side of things, and it's very hard to argue whether it is a game or not, because according to some definitions it is, and according to others it's not. And if you ask the people who made it, they might say one thing, and if you ask the people who visited and basically experience the installation, they might say another thing. So I think this is the last slide before we go to the edge cases. And those are the pragmatic definitions, which means those are not used as definitions when arguing in a scientific context or when writing a paper, but more of a design or analysis tool. We already mentioned Sid Meier's idea of a game is a series of interesting choices. So keep in mind this is not a theoretical definition that you can use to define a game, because of course a lot of things will fall beneath it that are commonly not understood as a game. But you can use it as a design tool when designing your own games, for example. Try to make a series of interesting choices within it, because otherwise the player might get bored, which is at least Sid Meier's philosophy. Then you have the MDA model. We only mentioned it very shortly on Tuesday in René's lecture. But this is an important model for both designing games and also analyzing games, because the interesting thing about it is that you have those three aspects that give the model its name. You have M is mechanics, D is dynamics, and A is aesthetics. And as a designer, you basically start with the mechanics, all the rules that make up the game, then go on to the dynamics, how those rules interact with each other and form a system. And finally, the aesthetics is how it is all presented to the player on the screen. But on the other hand, from the player's perspective, of course, it goes the other way around. So if you analyze a game from a player's perspective, you will start with the aesthetics, then you will gain more insight about how the system works with its dynamics, and finally you might understand the whole design process that went into the mechanics, the rules of the game. There is a paper available for free that I also posted on the Discord, which I highly recommend everyone to read, the MDA model, and later on, or maybe in one of the other classes you already heard about the NAME model, NAME as well. Those are the two tools that are very useful for game analysis, also in the context of your video game diary that you have to hand in by mid-January, I think, if you want feedback on it, and which will also be an essential part of the exam at the end of the game studies lecture. So I highly recommend everyone to hand something in that regard. And when you try to figure out some aspects of your game, you can always cite this MDA model and then use some aspects of it to analyze your game from a player's perspective. I'm not sure how clear that was, because this is only a very short overview of how all of this works. I hope if you take the time to read the paper, any questions will be answered, but if you have some, please let me know right away or later on as well.
Coming from a technical background, this makes the most sense.
Yeah, because suddenly you have those familiar graphs again and understand what is meant when talking about a more game design approach. But I'm glad. If it makes sense, then that's a good thing.
What is interesting, though, especially as you mentioned, being from a tech background, Alan, is that nonetheless, what mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics are is also grounded in which definitions we choose to, reason on that. So, and these are mostly then again based on theoretical models, right? So this is more or less like in theory made practical, somehow. And I also think that this model is extremely valuable and very helpful to engage with games, not just theoretically, but also practically, also in development.
Yeah, it feels like a very good bridge between them.
And in addition, also one thing that shows how good this model is. I mean, this is now my opinion, but just look at when this came out and still in development. This, but also like a concept like flow remains like something like a gold standard. This just shows how, in a sense, universal but also sustainable this concept is.
Yeah, some things just stand the test of time and others do not. And it's just something you have to keep in mind with theories. But if you have like a theory that's very useful and applicable as the MDA model, then it most likely will find itself even years later in research. Alright then. I have here the slides with examples of edge cases. Of course, I put in the games that we discussed during the lecture and also what I posted on Discord. But first I wanted to ask all of you, maybe you have some examples of your own, of where you're not sure if it would fit the definitions of a game that we discussed today, or where you're not sure yourself if it's a game or not. Let me know. Any ideas? Overall silence, quite unfortunate. So let us take something that's very popular as a game like Minecraft. What might be the problem with some of the definitions we learned today and Minecraft? For example, if you just take creative mode.
I mean, it is still bound to a set of rules and constraints, so I think it still fits the definition of a game.
Or at least some of the definitions, yeah. Maybe we can go back some steps and find some things where it doesn't fit.
Okay, I have never played Minecraft, but you said creative mode, that sounds like completely sandbox. So basically a program where you can build or not build whatever you want. So looking at this graph, yeah, so maybe you could say it doesn't have any pre-negotiated consequences.
So that's what I think as well.
Yeah, whatever you want.
So usually you don't have consequences. You often don't even really have a quantifiable outcome, because the only outcome you might have whether you succeed in building what you set out to do or not. But that's not a quantifiable outcome other than by yourself. So basically you yourself would have to decide on that or not, and that's more akin to like art, maybe like drawing a painting and whether you're satisfied with it at the end or not. Whereas in Minecraft, the game doesn't really give you feedback whether you succeeded or not. Or at least I'm just talking about creative mode here. And then there is artificial conflict, which also doesn't really exist. So yeah, but even though those things don't apply, most people will still argue that Minecraft creative mode is a game, a video game even. And of course, because it is coupled with the adventure mode, which actually has those elements like artificial conflict and quantifiable outcome, basically Minecraft fits every definition of a game anyway. But let's go back to some other edge cases. So this was shown in the lecture, or René, I think he posted a video of it. Anyone have an idea what that is?
The game of life.
So what's interesting about the game of life? Or there's probably lots of interesting things, but what do you think I mean when I'm talking about it here?
It's a game that we have no control over apart from, it just plays itself, I guess.
I would rather say that it's a simulation more than a game.
It is a simulation, but it is also specifically called the game of life. So it even has the word game in the title. Of course, you can argue that it doesn't make it a game just because it has it in the title. But yeah, it's what's commonly considered a zero-player game. So even though you can, some implementations allow the person who uses it to set a field at the very start. Once you press play, basically there is no player interaction anymore. So there is no change whether a player is present or not. And yet it has a system with a dynamic changing state, so it fits most of the other definition of a game. But you don't need a player. And as we saw, according to many definitions, you need a player that plays the game or interaction between the player and the system. But here you only have interaction within the system itself. So would you consider this a game or not? Alan already said it's more of a simulation, which I think he means that it's not a game.
I think that you can consider it a game because initially you have to set up a number of pixels to work with. I'm not really sure how it works because I never tried it, but I know what's about. Every pixel has a set of rules to interact with each other.
Yeah, so you can look up the rules. I think, as far as I remember, it is when there's 2 or less neighbors, the pixel dies. If there is 3 neighbors, the pixel basically spawns, or like if there is an empty pixel and it has exactly 3 neighbors, then it becomes active as well. And then if it has more than 3, it also dies by overpopulation. And basically you have step by step, every pixel is checked which rules apply, and then each pixel decides on whether it lives or dies.
The fact is that this type of game, in quotes game, we don't know from the start what will happen. So probably we can say that the game aspect is that is uncertain. So the uncertainty.
It is actually deterministic, right? So theoretically, you could calculate out what will happen.
Yeah, but
it's impossible as humans.
Does that make it a game? Is gambling based on this kind of information a game? I think you can argue this being a game at most for the coder who has designed that. But I think that here the aspect of not being able to engage with it, except of course cognitively, draws it, pulls it far away of what one should define as a game. So I definitely disagree here.
So you think also that it's not a game?
Yes.
So if you would take, for example, many fighting games or even strategy games allow you to have matches between bots, where you set up a normal match, but instead of joining as a player, you just have computers battling each other. Would you still consider that a game then?
No, I mean, this happens within a game, of course, but this is, this is a very good example actually. But I mean, you have basically 2 AI playing a game, but you I think it's important to consider that a game is something that is activated by a player, right? And the moment that we are not anymore part of this system, a game becomes more of something going into the direction of a simulation or a movie or something that is at least visually perceivable. But very good example about the 2 AI. I have never thought about that.
So yeah, you could argue, for example, that it ceases to be a game as soon as interactivity is lost. Of course, for example, when you set up Super Smash Bros. For 2 computers to fight against each other, you still have interactivity as a player by being able to pause it, to cancel the match and then play yourself, right? In the game of life, in theory, that's not really possible. Some implementations have the possibility to pause it. and then even set some cells yourself, but the very original idea of it doesn't. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, that's something. So if you are able to select an easy mode in a game, for me, point of view, the game is not any more challenging. I mean, the outcome doesn't count.
So you argue that in a game that is so easy that basically it doesn't matter what you do as a player, it's the same as a game where you just look at the screen and see what's happening like a movie.
I think that's why From Software games are successful.
But you still have to interact with the game.
Yeah, you see.
Without your interaction, you cannot complete the game.
But how is this interaction? I mean,
I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about your example with the easy game.
Yeah, but this interaction is not. I mean, it's just there. It's not. You are not enjoying. You are not like.
What about text adventure games? You could say this is very similar because you have like in the beginning you pick an option, say like here you pick where to place the pixels, and then you just read the text that comes after your decision. Kind of like watching these pixels, dance and play around here as well.
So could you think of an idea that might be different in that regard? Do you think there is an attachment to the outcome, for example, with a text adventure as opposed to the game of life?
Yeah, I guess in a text adventure game it's designed to have some kind of goal, and here there already isn't one. So there's a difference. Touché.
So as you can see, you can use different definitions to arrive at different conclusions as well. And yeah, that's why it's hard to really define those edge cases. Another example, yeah?
Besides not having player interaction, you can make your goal seeing what is going to happen with the pixels you've placed.
Yeah, that you can, but that's once again a very personal goal that's not set by the game but by the player. But of course you can argue that it exists and that makes it a game for you.
I mean, if you consider that a game, wouldn't developing a game would be a game?
That's what some people actually argue, yes. That developing a game is a game in and of itself. Because after all, especially in modern compilers and stuff, you get feedback, you even have fail states, like when it fails to compile, you get exception errors and whatever feedback from the IDE. So coding for many people is actually very similar to a game, especially when you have a personal goal of finishing the game and a quantifiable outcome of whether the game is finished or not, and things like that. So yeah, it might actually fit many definitions of being a game as well. So
I think that would be only a challenge, a game.
Come again?
That would be only a challenge, not a game.
Yeah, well, for some people, I think it was even mentioned, challenge is what makes a game.
Okay.
If I remember correctly, the game of life is used in many things like simulations of explosions.
Okay. I don't even know. I know it's a very popular thing in actual mathematical sciences. That it's still used by some people, and it's also been proven to be Turing complete. So you can basically form a whole computer within it. But yeah, there's lots of applications. It's a very interesting concept from just those 3 simple rules. And it can also lead to insight, right? For example, this is just an example, but it can lead you to believe that our universe is made up of similar simple rules, that you just have a couple of core rules, and those basically make up all those complex systems that are all around us. But the next picture, unfortunately it's pretty small, but this is the art installation we talked about earlier and also in the lecture of TextRain. So you have people in front of a screen waving around their hands and letting text fall onto their bodies. And when the computer realizes that the texture of where the text is right now is dark enough, it stops falling down. So you basically have an interaction that's similar to actual real physical objects falling down from the sky. And that allows people who interact with the art installation to collect text on their whole bodies, basically. So what do you think the problem might be here, with it being a game or not?
If I go outside and it's snowing or raining and I wait between the rain and the ground and don't let them fall on the ground, is that a game?
Well, could it be? Could you imagine a video game where you do exactly that, but you get some reward for catching more or less snow, and then depending on that, you have a fail or a winning state?
Okay, yeah, in those cases maybe, because we have those games, but in this case, this example, this is not a game. You just prevent them from falling to the ground and then you let them fall. Yay, happy you.
Yeah.
I think it counts as play.
I think this is also an important argument to realize, that something can be playful or play, but not a game. So what's usually the distinction here is the clear set of rules that are enforced by a system. And if you don't have those, then it's usually more play than game.
Maybe if you don't catch the words and you lose, could be called a game.
So what you could do is create your own rules while playing, and then it becomes a game for you. But the installation in and of itself is not a game, because it doesn't have any rules it enforces, is what one might argue. The next example, I don't know if any of you took a look at it. It's called LSD Revamped.
I did, and
yeah.
I have no idea what I was doing in that. Just walking around, touching walls and changing position. Like, what was the point?
So I mean,
based on that, I don't consider it a game, because I really had no idea what I was doing there, and I didn't consider it fun, interesting, or experience or anything anyway. And basically everything was interaction. So yeah, I just didn't find a point in it to consider it a game.
So what do you think what was missing?
First of all, the goal, because it was not clear what the point was. And set of rules, like everything I did, the map changed. Like, so what? Give me a rule, like, okay, if you touch this wall, it changes. If you touch this, you lose, for example. That would make it a game, maybe. But in general, it really had no point of a game.
Well, everyone who didn't try it out, I can only suggest try it out yourself. And see.
I mean, probably is a representation of taking LSD.
I think that was the original idea behind it, yes. I think it was the original game, if you want to call it that, was released on PlayStation, and this revamped edition is now a fan-made re-rendering of that, for which you can download for free on the PC.
Maybe someone who took LSD can compare the LSD and the game and tell us if it's accurate or not.
And what do you think would fit that very well is, well, I'll just give my opinion, this whole idea of games being engines of experience, so that you're given an experience that was designed by the designers specifically to communicate something. And I think this is a prime example of where this fits. So if you want to give somebody the experience of being on LSD by a game, you can do that with that. But of course, by other definitions, like for example, having a clear outcome, some attachment to the outcome, rules that are clearly communicated to the player, those things all don't apply here. And the final one that I posted in the Discord is this whole, what was it called? I think it's just like work or something similar.
Yeah. I call it an annoyance simulator.
So maybe some more of you played that one. If not, I can recommend it. You just need to play it for a couple of minutes to understand what it is trying to do, I think. And it basically simulates a boring, more or less boring desk job that with very many annoying windows and pop-ups. So what do you think? Could this be considered a game?
I think it comes down to individuals, what they think. Because we have games like Track Simulator, I think it's called.
Mm-hmm.
And you just drive around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and many people really enjoy them and play them often.
And why do you think they play those games?
I'm not really sure because I'm not attracted to these types of games.
Well, if you try to imagine why they could play it, what could be a good reason? Maybe because they give them opportunities that they cannot actually experience in real life, or not easily.
Yeah, I was gonna say many simulations give you experiences that you can never have on your own, but I don't really know what this gave me.
I wouldn't completely agree because my boyfriend is a train conductor, and when he comes home, he's playing a train simulator. So he's basically just continuing work at home.
That's fascinating.
There was a guy on Twitch who was... Okay, go on.
Go on.
Okay, there was a guy on Twitch who was a truck driver, and in his free time was playing on stream Truck Driver Simulator.
Euro Truck Simulator.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe
You could argue for them work is game.
Yeah. My theory is completely been blasted apart. Well, then we don't really know why people really play those games. Maybe it's just because they enjoy it, right? But still, it's a simulation. Do you think this workplace simulation, it's just like work, could be considered enjoyable to some?
It's not like work. I mean, well, it's not as realistic as it should be. Maybe like the object come like select this and press this button. Okay, yes, sir. But actually, sir, I actually realized something. That's a yes, sir situation. Like you just follow orders. It could actually be like a work, but I think it doesn't have enough rules to be even a simulator.
Oh, really? Okay. I think it has a lot of rules of what it allows the player to do. And
what? Just type and just press buttons and...
Those are already rules. And very clearly communicated and strictly defined rules as well, right?
Also, break time was too short. I was playing the game. It didn't let me finish.
But do you think this kind of game, or whatever it might be, tries to communicate something as well?
That jobs are boring, maybe?
Yeah, maybe. It's just trying to give an insight of this kind. And once again, this is basically the whole idea of giving an experience to the player, which, according to some, might make it a game. I personally find this also kind of problematic because then a lot of interactive art would instantly become games, because many kinds of art try to communicate some kind of thing to the person, and if that's all that it needs to be a game, then suddenly some books that try to make a very specific point or similar also become games.
Okay, that's why I say it didn't have enough rules. Like, if you add some rules, I don't know, for example, Flight Simulator, it has perfect set of rules for how you drive the plane or stuff like that, or it has even mods where you have to like land on a specific place and stuff. Those can make it a game. I'm not necessarily saying that is a game, but this one will just, if you want to type, okay, maybe if it had certain goals to type, not just press buttons and it types automatically something for you, or maybe the buttons or the task meant something, maybe it could be a game, but at this point I think it's just something.
I see.
Just something.
Just some kind of simulation, or maybe just some kind of art piece. Yeah, it's also hard to define what it is if it isn't a game. But you also mentioned something. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that there are so many games without a goal that are still considered games. So saying that a possible game is missing a goal, I don't think it's actually a strong argument.
Do you have some examples?
Probably most of us played the GTA when we were kids, just driving around and killing people.
Yes.
We weren't
still did the
following
job.
the. Yeah, but we weren't playing by the rules. We were just playing.
Yeah,
Sorry,
but-
not that we weren't playing by the rules. We weren't playing for the goal.
Maybe our goal was to earn money and just kill people and pick up $50.
So again, it comes down to us creating our own goals.
So that one point where you create your own goals, especially in a sandbox game, is very true. And I also think that's important to keep in mind when trying to define games by their goals, because there is many sandbox games that only rely on the players making their own goals. The whole idea about rules, I think you have a little bit wrong, because the game engine still has its own rules, like, for example, how physics work in the game, that people drop money when you kill them, how you drive your car.
Yeah.
Those things are also considered rules, just to keep that
Yes,
in mind.
I made the mistake earlier when I said not playing by the rules.
Yeah, just wanted to make sure everyone understands the difference between rules and goals in that regard.
But I feel like we come back to the to my question earlier about when you said that the definition of a game should be objective.
Yeah, do you think it can be?
Right now we are very subjective of what a game is. So I'm a little confused.
Yeah. So in the end, the insight basically is that there is no objective definition that works for everybody, and that's why games is such a complex topic in that regard. Like, I personally like the Wittgensteinian approach the most, where you have this family resemblance. So you have some attributes that basically almost every game has, but none of those attributes is absolutely essential. So you will always find examples of where it doesn't work like that. But in general, defining games is very difficult. So nobody has managed to find a clear, perfect, objective definition yet. And that's why we had a whole lecture and like 2 reading group sessions by now where we talked about defining games, just to show how difficult it is. And that is the main insight you can have. So you can't really do it objectively. If you write about ontology or defining games in one way or another, you need to give your own definition that other people can then work with. But in general, we just have this clearly. I really like this graph by Joule for this reason, because we have this inner circle where we have things that are clearly considered games by everybody, and this outer circle of things that are clearly not considered games. But in between, we have all of those borderline cases where it's very hard to say they fit the definition of a game or not.
I don't quite agree with that image anyway. Like, is poker a game?
Yeah, what do you think?
I think it is a game, but based on this description, it's a game based on chance for most of the part, and it cannot be a game, or it's a borderline case, but it's obviously a game.
Yeah.
Like, people enjoy it, they are fun, and it has rules, and
many poker players will also disagree with you that when you say it's purely chance-based.
Yeah, that's true, but in the end...
What about blackjack?
About what?
Blackjack.
Blackjack.
Oh, actually,
you can count the cards, I think.
Yeah, you have some opportunity, but it's widely considered cheating. But yeah, I also disagree with the whole idea of taking away chance-based or gambling in general. But the idea here where Joule takes away gambling from games themselves is usually because you have some kind of monetary, what's the word? You put money down on the table and then play for that. So the game itself is still a game in its own closed-off space, but as soon as you enter with real-world money, you basically break the magic circle, because you have lasting influences on your real life by betting money.
I think Huizinga said that by playing you can't earn things.
That was the original idea of the Magic Circle. Of course, nowadays you have bets, you have gambling, and you have esports where you earn money by playing. So
I'm in a stream.
or streaming, yeah, exactly, where you also earn money
Yeah,
by
but
playing.
but you don't earn money directly from playing.
And we also talked about the whole idea of Playboy and NFTs in video games a couple of sessions ago, where you can actually theoretically earn money directly by playing.
There's also this software called Playweek, where you can basically you see some ads before you start a certain match, and you have a goal, like for example, win that match, or I don't know, make 20 punches, for example. And if you complete that goal, you get some in-app coins, and later you can gather your coins and get like PayPal wallets with that, or gift cards with that. I think I won about $20 from that software, so
Damn.
that was directly playing and gaming and making money, I think.
I never even heard of that, but that does sound kind of scammy, because I think what you get paid for is watching the ads, not actually playing the game.
Maybe check it out.
No, I mean, in the end, the company that sells you the game makes money by ads and shares some of the money with you.
It's not about the company that says the games are normal games, like Brawlhalla, Rocket League, Rainbow Six.
Oh, okay.
You just watch ads in this software, like add it on top of that.
I see,
So
I see.
check it out.
Okay, maybe you can
It's
post the
different
name
than what
of
you
it.
think.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's Playweek. I will send you a link later.
Nice. Okay. Any further comments? Because we're already a little bit over time once again, but just let it all out.
I was just thinking about what we talked earlier. Maybe any activity that have diversion inside it. It will be really hard to define it with an objective definition.
Yeah, that's a good
So
insight.
probably when an activity grows and diverges into many other subcategories, the difficulty of defining it also increases.
Very likely. That's just a general problem we have with definitions. Of course, in science in general, we rely very much on definitions. But yeah, today we learned why it is so hard to define games, because after all, it's a very subjective thing for the most part, and also some of the other problems we mentioned. But yeah, once again, I stole some art. I'm not even sure if this one is from Nick or not.
It is. It was supposed to be for the Twitch channel, but I don't think they've uploaded it for it yet.
It is on the official KCGL site, so I stole it from there.
Oh.
But yeah, thank you all for attending and participating. I'm glad we had some more lively discussion today. I hope to see you again next week. I hope, even if Ellen doesn't think it is, I hope at least for the rest of you, the lectures will become more relaxed and bearable from now on when we use Felix's slides. At the very end, I think the last and the second to last lecture will once again be René's slides, so look forward to that. But other than that, I think it will be more smooth sailing from now on, and we will also come back to a lot of things we learned and have some practical examples about those that put it into context. So I hope you look forward to that.
I'd like just to mention one last thing, namely that Tom and I will be presenting our research on Saturday at the Frog conference. So just if you guys want to chime in, it's for free. I will post you the link to here. You need to register though, but it's all for free. You don't need, I mean, like, there are very interesting talks. So our other panelists, there are really some great names. So if you're interested, however, also if you want to see what we're working on, will be there, and also tomorrow we'll be presenting our game Distressed is at the Subutron event. I'll also post a link in here. So if you got time, chime in.
Yeah, I think most of it is online now. It's gonna be streamed on Twitch and recorded and stuff like that as well. But yeah, we will post probably the links on the study group Discord anyway. So if you're interested, make sure to join that Discord that I posted earlier today. So yeah, and once again, also a reminder for the journal. Please write an essay and send it to us. Don't be afraid that it doesn't fit what we might consider an essay. The worst thing you get is feedback to improve your essay. And with that, I say thanks to all of you. Hope to see you again next week. Stay safe, stay healthy. Keep in mind that Austria is in lockdown, so don't do anything stupid. And see you around.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Tom, I have small questions if you have
Sure.
time.
Mhm.